Hi and welcome to the sensory part of the ASD workshop. My name's Stella Parkinson and I'm a paediatric occupational therapist. I'm based in Ashford, working out of the Rainbow Centre, and what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about sensory processing, what we mean by that, and what it can look like when children have sensory difficulties. We're also going to have a look in video 2 at strategies that you might want to start trying to see if it helps. So the first thing to say, I think, is that sensory can sometimes be the part of the diagnosis that isn't often as understood. But sometimes for some children it's actually a really important part of the diagnosis. It can be key to taking part in lots of activities. It can be really difficult to take part in activities if you're not understanding your sensory environment, and sometimes when we can look at addressing that, lots of other things can fall into place. So hopefully you'll find this helpful. There's a really good advice sheet which I put in the references, which will come up on your second video, which I'd advise looking at as well. I'll come on to that when we get to it, but what I want to say really is don't worry if after watching this video, if you're still not 100% clear on the sensory part of things. It can take time for us to build up that understanding, and it is all guesswork with sensory. So we're looking at what we think we might be seeing and trying strategies to see if that helps. And the leaflet that I recommend at the end is really good to just go back over the kind of things that we're going to talk about today. And it's also really helpful for other people that work with our children to give them a better understanding as well. Okay, so the first thing we need to think about when we talk about sensory processing is that we are thinking about information that's picked up from our senses. So our first senses that we know most about are the 5 senses that tell us about our external environments, and they are our touch, taste, sight, sound and smell. So they tell us about everything that's going on around us, what's going on outside of our bodies at any one time. So they're our external senses. We also have an additional 2 senses which we don't necessarily know as much about, but they are equally as important, and those senses are so these 2 senses tell us about everything that's going on inside of our bodies. They tell us about our internal environment. So the feedback comes from our bodies. The one that's on the left hand side is called proprioception, and really that's feedback that we get from our muscles and joints. So our muscles and joints tell us information about what position our body is in at any one time. So you can shut your eyes and you know from your muscles and joints whether you're sitting down. If you are sitting down, are your legs crossed? Have you got your arms crossed? What kind of position is your body in? That's all coming from your inside. That's coming from inside your body. So it's not coming, say, from your skin. Your skin will be telling you about stuff that's on the outside of your body, like maybe what kind of clothes you're wearing, how tight your shoes are. Your muscles and joints are telling you what position you're in. And that body sense gets combined with the second body sense, which is vestibular, and that is information about our movement and our balance. So it comes from the inner ear and it gives us a good idea of basically whether we're moving, and if we are moving, how quickly are we moving. It also tells us if we're upright, if we're lying down, if we're falling down. That information all comes from your inner ear, and those 2 body senses get combined together. They give us a really good sense of what is going on inside of our bodies. Okay, and that's basically just a summary of what we've just talked about. So how we make sense of ourselves and our environment is the information that we receive from our senses and how our brains interpret it. So it's our understanding of all of that information. That's the processing part. It's what our brains do about the information that we receive from our senses. Okay. So like I said, it's our brain's understanding. It's an automatic process. We don't have to think about it. It happens all the time. It happens before we're born. When we're in utero, we start understanding and processing sensory information. We all know that you can play music to babies before they're born and they it will hear that and respond to it, as well as voices and things like that. It's a complex process, so we really rely on our brains being very good at processing this information. It's really important for our brains to decide which tiny parts of all of that information that we're getting we need to pay attention to, because most of the time we can ignore the vast majority of it. So all of our senses are giving us, our brains, information constantly, but our brains, as we get older, get really good at understanding, oh, okay, I think I need to pay attention to that. I don't think I need to pay attention to everything else. So if we take our auditory sense, which is sound, we would hopefully be able to tune into the sound that we need to listen to. So for example, hopefully right now you'd be able to tune into my voice, but our brains are still receiving information about other things, that other sounds that might be going on in our environments, but our brains choose to ignore them, or we hopefully do. So if there was a noise outside, your brain would probably go, okay, there's talking outside, I don't need to pay attention to that, or I might be aware of it, but I'm going to try and filter it out. Same if there was any other kind of background noise like music. And that's the same for all of our senses. So again, for example, our movement and balance sense will be also telling us, hopefully, we're sitting upright, we're not moving, we're stationary, we're not falling over. And again, our brains get really good at thinking, okay, I know I'm not falling over, I don't really need to pay attention to that, so I can just tune into what that person's saying. As well, our brains get really good at switching quickly if we need to. So if there was a change to either of those senses, so for example, instead of someone just chatting outside, if our auditory sense picked up that the fire alarm had gone off, our brains get really good at going, oh, actually, I think I do need to pay attention to that and I need to do something about it. So I need to respond to it rather than just ignore it. So we choose the appropriate response, which is, I'm going to react to it, I'm going to leave the building, find out what's going on. And the same again with all of our senses. So if our movement and balance sense, for whatever reason, maybe our chair broke, told us we were falling down, then we'd really quickly go, oh, right, I do need to respond to that. I'm falling. I need to do something about it. I need to try and save myself to stop myself banging my head. How well we do all of that, so all of that filtering and all of that paying attention and not paying attention to different bits, can be variable. So there are always certain times in our day when we are really good at it, and there's always certain times or certain states that actually we're not quite so good. And that might be when we get really annoyed by things because our brains are paying too much attention to them. So for example, if we're feeling stressed, if we're tired, maybe we're not very well, or if we're hungry, then we might start getting more bothered by sensory information because our brains are just that little bit too slow at filtering stuff out. So for me, the thing that will always get annoying for me, because I'm not as good at filtering out, is sound. So I know that I find it very difficult to concentrate if there's background noise, and I actually really prefer silence. For other people, they need background noise to concentrate, and that's completely fine. You know, it's just personal. It's just depending on the person. So I know I need a quiet room if I'm going to do some concentrating, if I'm going to do some work. And I also know that that's the thing that will probably annoy me if I'm feeling stressed. Or if I'm feeling tired. So if I'm driving home and the wrong song comes on the radio, or it's too loud, that will really bug me, and that's the thing that I'll have to do something about. And it depends on the person, so it's individual. But I think it's really key to note that even for us, there are certain times that actually we do get really bothered by sensory information and we're not very good at filtering it out, and that's really difficult. And that's really important to remember for our children, because if they are struggling with processing sensory information, then most of their day will be like I am when I'm tired or stressed. They're getting bothered by it a lot, if not all the time. And that might be different if they're in the perfect circumstance. So if they've had a great night's sleep, they're feeling wide awake, they've had a good breakfast, so they're not hungry, and they're feeling really well, and they're doing an activity they want to do, in that specific situation, the stuff that normally bothers them might be okay and they can tolerate it. But usually that will be the exception for them, because they've had this perfect combination of feeling okay. It won't necessarily be the norm, which it would be for us. So I think that's really important for people to understand, especially people that are working with our children, that they're not putting it on because, well, yesterday when they were doing Lego, they weren't bothered by the hand dryer, but today they are. It's like, well, that's okay, because yesterday maybe they were really, really feeling in a good place and they were able to just about deal with that hand dryer, but today it's not the case. Okay. So once we understand what sensory processing is, then we can start thinking about what we use it for and why it's important. The first thing we use sensory processing or sensory information for is it helps us to control our alert levels. So our alert levels are basically how awake and how sleepy we are during the day, and that really fluctuates. There are some times of the day that we're feeling our alert levels running quite low, and then we'd use sensory information to wake ourselves up. And there are other times of the day when we're feeling our alert levels are actually really high, and we would use sensory information to bring our alert levels down and calm ourselves down. So if someone was to get up in the morning, generally speaking, even if you're a morning person, your alert level's still relatively low, you're still feeling a little bit sleepy, but slowly as you get ready, maybe you have a wash, you walk downstairs, you get some movement, you have a cup of tea, maybe breakfast, maybe a shower, turn the radio on. All of that is sensory information, and generally speaking, in the morning, hopefully that will bring our alert levels up and we start to feel more awake. And the same for last thing at night. So if we get home and we are feeling really stressed and we're just thinking, oh, my brain is so awake, I'm never going to go to sleep, there will always be certain things that we do to bring our alert levels down. So maybe have a warm bath, listen to relaxing music, watch something on the telly, read a book, have a glass of wine. There'll be things that we do to bring our alert levels down before we're ready to get into that sleep mode. And that fluctuates during the day. So again, for me, straight after lunch, if I've just eaten a big lunch and I'm in a meeting and I'm in a warm room and the lighting level is quite low, I really notice my alert level dropping. And then there'll be things that I do to try and bring my alert level up. I might have a drink of water, I might chew on my pen, fidget a bit in my chair. And that will be the same for our children as well. But usually when children try to change their alert levels, they're doing it in a more extreme way because they need more sensory information. So we'll really notice if their alert level drops, because they'll be really squirming and they'll be desperate to move and jiggle because they're desperately trying to bring their alert levels up, so they try to calm them, wake themselves up. The other thing that sensory processing helps us to do is basically learn and develop. So when we're little, before we go to school, most of our learning is done through play. It enables us to interact with toys, understand what they do, understand how to work them. We do that, we get better at it, we go on, we move on to more complicated toys. Obviously, when that goes up into school age, then we're looking at actually working and studying and paying attention in class. Things like handwriting, developing skills, developing all of our big movement skills, so things like PE, riding a bike. Think about how tricky that would be if your balance isn't working that well, or if we're not understanding our balance sense very well. It helps us to interact with other people. If we're struggling to process what people are saying because we're not able to tune into that very well, or we're struggling to process what someone looks like because our visual sense isn't giving us great feedback, then actually just having a conversation with someone can be really difficult. It starts developing our self-esteem, because if we notice that we're developing our skills and interacting with people appropriately, we start to feel good about ourselves, and we start noticing, oh, okay, I was good at that, I'd like to do that again, I'm going to do it better next time. If we're not so good at it, we don't feel as good about ourselves, and we start going, I'm not doing that, I've tried to do that. I've tried to ride my bike. I fall off it every time, and I'm really trying. I'm not doing it anymore. And then we get stuck because our development of our sensory processing gets stuck at the level that we are comfortable at. The last two are quite important. So basically, where we process sensory information in our brain is the same place that we process emotions and that we respond to threat. So every experience that we have, we tag it as being a good experience. Do I feel good about myself because of that? Am I happy about it? Do I feel like that's been really successful? Or do I not, because I didn't respond to it in the way that I'd wanted to, and I don't feel very good about it, or I'm absolutely terrified of it because every time I hear the hairdryer, it makes me really scared because it's coming through so loud, and I'm going to make that a negative emotion in my body, and I'm going to respond to it negatively. And that is linked to the threat response, which is our fight and flight response. Our fight and flight response is activated when we perceive something as being scary. And when we think something's scary, we either need to respond to it by fighting it, running away from it, or sometimes freezing, usually one of the first two. And if we're tagging these experiences, because we're not understanding the sensory information, and we're tagging them as negative and we're tagging them as a threat, then we will often respond to them as if they were absolutely terrifying. So my response, if I wasn't processing sound in the right way, my response to something very basic like someone talking outside or maybe something just dropping in the room might be on the same level that I've heard the fire alarm going off and I need to really respond to that because my understanding of it is skewed. I'm not responding to it in the right way. Okay, so we're going to have a look now at what it looks like when we don't understand sensory information as well as we could do. So the first thing to note is that all children are developing their sensory processing. We're not perfect. When we're born, we really don't understand any sensory information. And we start understanding it more and more as we get older. So the older we get, the more experience we've got of the world of sensory information, the more understanding we've got, the better able we are to choose our response and go, oh yeah, I remember that last time. I don't need to run away when the fire alarm goes off because I remember from last time. I'm just going to walk out the room and find out what's going on. And we kind of keep practicing and get better at it until we get around to our late teens, and then we basically process sensory information as well as we're going to do. What happens when children don't understand it effectively is that processing and that getting better at it tends to stop because we're not improving and we're not getting a better understanding of it. So we keep going over it again and again and again because it's still coming through at the same level it was when we were really small. So when we talk about sensory difficulties, sometimes children have difficulties because they're getting too much sensory information, and that's when one of their senses is what's described as oversensitive, and therefore they're just not filtering out all of that background information and it's all coming through at the same level. So that's when we talk about oversensitivity. Undersensitivity is actually when children don't get enough from one of their senses, so they're just not picking up that information and they need extra, and then they can start paying attention to it. But most of the time, if children have got sensory difficulties, they will have a combination of those two things. So they might have some things they're undersensitive to, some things they're oversensitive to, and sometimes even within one sense, they will have some things they're over and undersensitive to within that one sense. There's a good video, which, I hope you can see because I think my video's in the way, but I'm hoping you'll be able to click on that. It's a really good YouTube video that someone's put together of what it feels like for them when they have sensory overload and how terrifying it is for them. Another adult with autism once described it when he was little as being like he was in a small aircraft and he was going higher and higher with each sense that he was picking up and each thing that was happening, and he just felt like he was in the door which was open, and anytime anyone came near him or tried to speak to him or tried to ask him to do something, he felt like he was being pushed out of that door. And he just said, in that state, I couldn't have a conversation. I didn't have the capacity to listen to what that person was saying. I just wanted to fight him or her because I just didn't know what else to do. I was in absolute panic. So that video gives us a really good idea of why that might be, and what the world can look like when you are going into sensory overload. Just a quick word about why we're talking about it. So they do have a really good understanding of sensory and the link with autism now, so much so that they've included it as part of the diagnostic criteria. So they understand that most of the time, most people with a diagnosis of autism will respond to sensory information differently. For some people, it might not be a big problem, it might not even be that noticeable, whereas for other people, actually, sometimes it can be their main area of difficulty. It's also worth highlighting now just that there's no formal diagnosis of sensory processing difficulties, sensory processing disorder. They talked about whether it should be a formal diagnosis the last time they put together the diagnosing criteria for autism, and they said, actually, no, we're not going to include it. But you can have significant sensory difficulties without a diagnosis of anything. So in that case, we would usually describe the person as having difficulties with sensory information or processing sensory information. But certainly the diagnosis of SPD isn't an official diagnosis. Okay, we're just going to have a quick look now before we finish this part of the video at what it looks like when children have some oversensitivity to different senses. So like I said, it won't be all of their senses that are affected. It might be, but most of the time it's not. But generally speaking, children can often be mostly oversensitive and then have a bit of undersensitivity. And generally, if children are more oversensitive, obviously they're receiving a lot of information and it can feel quite overwhelming. And if you think about how that makes us feel when we're not in the right mood for it, they can often be in a high state of stress because you're activating that fight and flight response a lot during the day. And it's a constant, oh gosh, what was that? Oh gosh, what was that? And each time that happens, you get more and more sensitive and stressed. And then you are even more aware of sensation because you're even more in the fight and flight response. So these children really can seem to be in a very high state of stress. They will often seem to over-respond to things. So if we think about a child who seems to be fine, seems to be going into school okay, get them into the corridor, one child brushes past them in the corridor and they seem to massively overreact, whether they punch the child, scream, fall on the floor, whatever it might be, and all that child did was brush up to them. But if you think about whether that child that child brushing past them might have been about the 20th thing to activate their fight and flight response, because they might have woken up in the morning and their alarm or the person that woke them up, their voice was just a bit too loud or the alarm was a bit too loud, and that's been a bit funny. And then maybe they've gone downstairs and they've had breakfast and the milk was a lot colder than they were thinking, and again that was a bit of a shock. Maybe the cat brushed up next to them and they weren't expecting it, and again that was a bit of a shock. Maybe in the car the wrong kind of song came on or it was too loud, and again that was a bit of a shock. And it could be that by the time that one child brushes up next to them, it's just the last thing, it's the last straw, and that's the thing that goes. So sometimes it's been under the surface and it's just been not noticed because they cover it up. Okay, so what is helpful to do to work out whether a child might be oversensitive to sensation is have a look at the kinds of things that they're bothered by and work out if you can see patterns or clusters within the sense, within each one. The first one is what you might see if a child is tactile sensitive. So that's our skin, our touch sense. So those children tend to struggle with textures, different textures especially. That might be clothing, so different types of clothing, or it might be food, different textures of food at one time. They might want them all separated on the plate because obviously your skin is in your mouth and that's going to be tricky if you're tactile sensitive. They might have really struggled with messy play when they were little, so getting messy on their hands, getting paint, any kind of runny, sloppy texture on their hands might have been, no, thank you very much, or wipe it off straight away. They might also struggle with contact with other people, so they might be okay with hugs, but it has to be when they want a hug, and if you want to give them and they're not in the right mood, no, that's not okay. Or being too close to someone, or someone bumping into them unexpectedly, that kind of thing. The next one, auditory, so that's our sound. That's quite straightforward. Lots of noise, the wrong kind of noises, loud noises, the wrong pitch of noises, being distracted if there's noise outside the room. That's all a sign of oversensitivity to sound. Visual, if we're struggling with lots and lots of visual information coming through, then any room which has got lots of things going on can sometimes be really challenging and be really overwhelming, and they might end up being really over alert because of it. The same with even going out to just busy environments where there's lots of things going on, lots of people moving around and things like that. It might just be all too much for our visual sense if we're oversensitive. The next one is our movement and balance sense. So that tends to be just not liking any kind of fast movement that you're not in control of. So being picked up unexpectedly, having your feet off the floor, standing up on a bench, going on in a lift, going to the park, playgrounds, all of that type of movement activity can be difficult if you're oversensitive to vestibular. The next one is taste. So struggling with different tastes of food, potentially having a limited diet, being quite restricted with the different flavours that you'll have, wanting quite bland food. That might be a sign of oversensitivity to taste. And the last one is kind of relating to tactile really, but self-care can often be a really difficult thing for children if they're oversensitive, because any kind of unexpected self-care, hair cutting, hair washing, nail cutting, even just being washed can sometimes be too much. So self-care activities are often affected with oversensitivity. We're going to come on to the next part in a bit, actually, when we come on to the strategies. So I'll talk about that in a later slide. We're just going to have a quick look first at undersensitivity. So children who are undersensitive, like I said before, they will need extra of the sensation, because from just getting the normal amount, they're kind of like, no, that's not doing anything. So a lot of the time, these children could be relatively sleepy, lethargic. If you think about when I was talking about someone getting up in the morning and having a tea, or a coffee, or having a shower, turning the music up, if you are undersensitive, you do all of that stuff and you still feel exactly the same as when you woke up. You are still, oh gosh, I feel so tired. So those children need so much more of that in order to bring their alert levels up and wake up for the day. So they can look really, really sleepy and lethargic, or sometimes they can actually run around seeking out more of the sensation because they're just not getting enough of it. And how that might look for each sense is, the first one, if it was undersensitivity to tactile, they might be seeking out lots and lots of extra touch. So they might like touching other people, objects, playing with people's hair, playing with labels in clothing, anything that they can do to get extra to their tactile sense. Smell is pretty straightforward. They might smell everything, especially before eating it. They might want to smell it first because they get so much from that, or they need more from that smell sense. They're not getting enough from just eating. Taste, they might mouth inedible a lot of the time items, and they can be really inedible. So I've had a child before who was undersensitive to taste and everything went in. Snails, cigarette butts, and he was way past the mouthing stage. It wasn't a developmental thing. It was literally, I am not getting anything from food, so I need something to taste for me. Seeking out extra movement is another fairly straightforward one. You'll just see them moving all the time. It might be spinning, rocking, wriggling around, jumping, anything they can do to get more to their inner ear to activate that movement response. Auditory, if they're not getting enough from their ears of sound, they might seek out extra. They might push their ear up against speakers and want to hear phones really closely. A lot of the time they're very unaware of hearing their name as well, because they're just getting very little, so it'll be really hard to isolate and pick out, oh, that was my name, because actually their auditory sense has just been so low that they're just not getting any of it. And a lot of the time they don't pick up on certain cues, things like the bell going off at school. They won't be aware of it, they haven't picked up on it, and their cue might be seeing everyone else stand up, and then they'll get up because they've seen everyone's getting up to go. The last thing, visual. If you're undersensitive, they might struggle with identifying where things are. So if a child is asked to get something, say, from a shelf, and there's 3 things on the shelf, and it's the blue one, and you say it's the blue one, and they're standing there looking, and you're going, it's right there, it's in front of you, it's the blue one, their visual sense just hasn't been able to identify it. They haven't picked up on it because they're just not getting enough, or their brains aren't processing or receiving enough of that sense. Another thing that's quite common is that they might bump into people or furniture. They find it difficult to judge how far away things are because their visual sense isn't very good at discriminating and knowing how far away you are from the table, or how quickly that person's moving towards you. You're just not perceiving that effectively. And these children most of the time will need more sensation in their day, so they benefit from us thinking, right, how are we going to work out that we can get more of the sensation they're lacking into their day? Okay, that's a real whistle-stop tour of sensory processing. And like I said, it's the beginning, so don't worry if some of that hasn't made sense. The leaflet I'll talk about in the next video is really good to go back over things, but obviously you'll get these slides as well, so you can go back and start piecing together what might be going on. I'm going to finish this video now, and then video 2 will be talking through strategies and things that we can do to help. So I will look forward to seeing you in video 2.